When you walk into an American courtroom, you look up at the bench and expect one thing: justice. You believe the person sitting in the black robe is the ultimate guardian of fairness. But what happens when the monster in the room is the judge himself? Imagine standing before a judge at just 13 years old. Your crime: creating a fake MySpace page to mock a school principal, or perhaps getting into a minor schoolyard scuffle, or stealing a $4 jar of nutmeg. In any normal court, these are misdemeanors. A slap on the wrist, a stern warning. But in Luzerne County, Pennsylvania, these minor infractions were a one-way ticket to hell, without warning, without legal representation, and sometimes in hearings that lasted less than 60 seconds. Children were ripped from their parents' arms, shackled at the ankles, and dragged away to maximum security juvenile detention centers. This wasn't a flaw in the system. It wasn't a mistake. It was a calculated, cold-blooded business model. Over the course of 5 years, nearly 4,000 children were systematically traded for cash. 2 highly respected judges, $2.6 million in illegal kickbacks, and thousands of stolen childhoods. This is the story of the largest and most devastating judicial corruption scandal in American history. A story of greed, broken lives, and a system that put a price tag on its youth. Welcome to the dark reality of the Kids for Cash scandal. To truly comprehend the sheer devastating magnitude of the Kids for Cash scandal, we cannot simply look at the end result of 2 corrupt men secretly taking financial bribes behind closed doors. We must first meticulously deconstruct the unique, deeply ingrained psychological environment that allowed this massive, systemic corruption network to operate in broad daylight for nearly a decade. We must deeply examine the community, the specific local culture, and the profoundly flawed perception of justice that completely blinded thousands of parents, dedicated teachers, and veteran law enforcement officers. This dark story does not begin with a multi-million-dollar wire transfer. It begins with an incredibly powerful, widely accepted illusion. Welcome to Luzerne County, Pennsylvania. Located in the heart of the Wyoming Valley, its county seat is the city of Wilkes-Barre. Historically, this is a distinct, proud region built upon the grueling, highly dangerous, and backbreaking labor of the American anthracite coal mining industry. The people of Luzerne County are characterized by a fiercely proud, blue-collar, working-class ethos. It is a tight-knit community that has always deeply valued hard work, traditional discipline, respect for elders, and most importantly, an absolute, unquestioning respect for authority and the strict rule of law. In a community with this specific demographic and psychological makeup, public officials are not just seen as distant political figures, they are local neighbors. Police officers are trusted implicitly, and sitting judges are viewed with a level of reverence akin to religious leaders. When a man in a black judicial robe speaks from the elevated wooden bench, the community listens without hesitation, and they obey without question. This inherent, unwavering trust in the judicial system was the very foundation upon which the greatest, most devastating betrayal of public trust in American legal history would soon be built. In the year 1995, a local, highly ambitious attorney named Marques Ciavarella Jr. launched an aggressive, highly visible political campaign and was successfully elected to the Luzerne County Court of Common Pleas. By the year 1996, he was officially assigned to preside over the county's juvenile court docket. Ciavarella was not a quiet, traditional background figure who simply interpreted the law from the shadows. He was highly visible, intensely charismatic, incredibly vocal, and fiercely driven by public perception and political power. He understood the deep-seated fears, anxieties, and vulnerabilities of his community perfectly, and he knew exactly how to psychologically weaponize those fears to build his own unstoppable political and judicial empire. To understand how he gained such absolute totalitarian power over the county, we must look at the national climate of the United States during the late 1990s. The entire country was experiencing a profound, media-driven cultural shift regarding juvenile crime. According to historical, criminological, and sociological records, this was the terrifying era of the super-predator myth. This was a widely publicized, highly sensationalized, yet ultimately debunked criminological theory formulated in the mid-90s that explicitly warned the American public of a coming generation of radically violent, remorseless, fatherless youth who would soon completely terrorize the streets. This nationwide anxiety, paranoia, and fear of children reached an absolute, catastrophic boiling point in April 1999. following the tragic and unprecedented Columbine High School massacre in Colorado. Across America, parents were terrified for their children's lives. Local school administrators were desperate for immediate, visible, and heavy-handed solutions to maintain control of their hallways and classrooms. Judge Mark Ciavarella flawlessly and ruthlessly capitalized on this nationwide panic and local hysteria. He campaigned heavily and continuously on a strict, uncompromising, and highly publicized zero-tolerance platform. He looked directly into the cameras of local news stations and boldly promised the anxious citizens of Luzerne County that he would be the iron fist that would fiercely protect their streets and their schools. He publicly and aggressively declared an all-out war on juvenile delinquency, boldly stating that no matter how incredibly minor the offense, there would be severe, life-altering consequences for any child who stepped out of line. To completely solidify his public image as the ultimate disciplinarian and the uncontested savior of the county, Ciavarella did something highly unusual and highly effective for a sitting judge. He deliberately left the confines of his courtroom and embarked on a massive, highly publicized speaking tour of local middle schools and high schools across the entirety of Luzerne County. He mandated these appearances, holding massive, mandatory school assemblies and forcing hundreds of teenagers to sit in absolute, terrified silence in their gymnasiums and auditoriums as he aggressively paced the stage holding a microphone. Multiple witnesses, former students, and veteran educators have provided chilling, highly consistent testimony under oath regarding his terrifying speeches. He would look directly into the crowds of 12, 13, and 14-year-old children and deliver a ruthless, uncompromising warning. His exact sentiment, echoed time and time again into the microphone, was this: if you mess up, if you break the rules, if you show any disrespect to authority, if you even think about stepping out of line, I will not hesitate to lock you up. I will take you away from your parents, and I will put you in a place you do not want to go. I will make sure you never see your bedroom again. To the terrified adults in the room, the overwhelmed teachers, the desperate principals, and the anxious parents sitting in the bleachers, this was exactly what they desperately wanted to hear. They did not see a power-hungry tyrant. They saw Mark Ciavarella as a righteous crusader, a stern, much-needed father figure who was finally bringing order, safety, and strict discipline to a chaotic, unruly generation of youth. Because of this intense public conditioning and his relentless psychological propaganda campaign, the local schools underwent a massive, systemic, and highly dangerous change in how they handled basic student behavior. Schools aggressively began referring students directly to the local police departments for incredibly minor, typical adolescent infractions that posed zero threat to public safety. A minor verbal scuffle in the hallway, a petty argument with a substitute teacher, a harmless teenage prank, creating a parody website, or throwing a piece of food in the school cafeteria, actions that for decades would normally result in a simple after-school detention, a trip to the principal's office, or a phone call to the parents, were now being fully, officially, and legally criminalized. The educational system had essentially transformed into a direct, high-speed, and heavily utilized pipeline, feeding thousands of local children directly into Ciavarella's courtroom. The schools and the police fully believed the strict judge was simply teaching these kids a tough, necessary lesson about respect and consequences. But what the trusting public saw on the evening news was a carefully crafted, deeply deceptive facade. Behind the heavy, soundproof wooden doors of his courtroom, Judge Ciavarella was not dispensing tough love. He was systematically, deliberately, and highly illegally dismantling the fundamental framework of the United States Constitution. The American juvenile justice system is fundamentally, morally, and legally designed to be rehabilitative, not punitive. It is intentionally meant to guide, correct, educate, and protect vulnerable youth, not utterly destroy their psychological well-being and their futures. However, Mark Ciavarella turned his Luzerne County courtroom into a merciless, terrifying, high-speed assembly line of human destruction. To truly understand the sheer scale of the judicial corruption taking place every single day, we must look at the hard, undeniable statistical data later uncovered by federal investigators, civil rights attorneys, and the Juvenile Law Center. According to extensive, verified state records, the statewide average in Pennsylvania for placing juvenile offenders in out-of-home secure detention facilities was roughly 10%. This meant that historically, out of every 100 children appearing before a judge in the entire state of Pennsylvania, only about 10, usually repeat, highly violent or extremely dangerous offenders, were actually removed from their homes and sent away to a secure lockup facility. In Luzerne County, however, entirely under the iron-fisted, unchecked control of Judge Ciavarella, That placement rate inexplicably skyrocketed to an astonishing 25% to 26%. He was actively locking up children at more than double, and sometimes nearly triple, the state average. He was ruthlessly sending terrified first-time offenders, completely non-violent youths, and children with minor, harmless misdemeanors to maximum security lockups meant for highly dangerous criminals. Any logical observer looking at these terrifying numbers would be forced to ask a deeply disturbing question: why? Why was one single, highly respected judge locking up children at 3 times the normal state rate? And who was secretly profiting from this massive, unprecedented influx of young prisoners? The public didn't ask, because they were entirely blinded by his zero-tolerance crusade. But the answer lay in how Ciavarella meticulously stripped these children of their ability to fight back. To keep this massive influx of children flowing smoothly into detention centers, Ciavarella had to eliminate the one thing that could stop him: defense attorneys. Every single American citizen, including a minor child, is fundamentally guaranteed the absolute right to legal representation under the Sixth Amendment of the United States Constitution. In a landmark 1967 Supreme Court decision, known as In Re Gault, the highest court in the land explicitly and legally ruled that children facing delinquency proceedings have the exact same right to an attorney as adults. If a family cannot afford a private lawyer, a public defender must be provided by the state at no cost. In a juvenile court, this constitutional right is absolutely crucial, as young children entirely lack the cognitive development, legal knowledge, or emotional maturity to understand complex legal proceedings, prosecutorial strategies, or the long-term devastating consequences of a guilty plea. Judge Ciavarella knew the law perfectly well, but he also knew that dedicated, aggressive defense attorneys would significantly slow down his highly profitable, high-speed assembly line. Lawyers would ask legally binding questions. Lawyers would file lengthy motions, demand evidence, cross-examine witnesses, review the psychological files of the children, and fiercely fight for the freedom of their young clients. A lawyer would quickly realize that a child should not be sent to a maximum security prison for stealing a $4 jar of nutmeg. So Ciavarella instituted a systematic, highly illegal, and profoundly deceptive psychological process to actively pressure vulnerable children and their deeply confused parents into permanently waiving their constitutional right to legal counsel. Official court records, massive federal audits, and extensive investigations by the Interbranch Commission on Juvenile Justice proved a terrifying, almost unbelievable statistical anomaly. In Judge Ciavarella's courtroom, between 50% and 60% of all children appeared before the bench completely alone, entirely without a lawyer. To put the sheer massive illegality of that staggering number into perspective, the state average for unrepresented youth in Pennsylvania at that exact same time was strictly less than 8%. How did one single judge achieve such a massive, unconstitutional anomaly under the noses of the entire legal community? The dark deception began the exact moment a family walked through the courthouse doors. Families arriving at the juvenile probation office, often anxious and terrified, were immediately handed a wooden clipboard with a piece of paper containing dense, highly confusing, and intimidating legal jargon. Court staff and probation officers, operating under Ciavarella's implicitly hostile and highly demanding environment, would routinely advise stressed, panicked parents to simply sign the waiver to make things go faster. They subtly and maliciously suggested that officially hiring a defense attorney would only anger the notoriously strict judge and result in a much harsher, more brutal punishment for the child. Parents, deeply intimidated by the massive, confusing legal system, terrified of the judge's ruthless public reputation, and falsely believing the court ultimately had their child's best interest at heart, unknowingly signed away their children's fundamental constitutional rights right there in the crowded waiting room. Once the child was successfully stripped of their legal defense and ushered inside the massive courtroom, the brutal reality of zero tolerance was executed with terrifying mechanical swiftness. Official court transcripts retrieved from hundreds of closed-door hearings reveal a devastating pattern of psychological and legal abuse. There was absolutely no judicial deliberation. There was no required legal inquiry into the child's background, no psychological evaluations requested, no review of their mental health history, and absolutely no questions asked about their home life or their grades. A typical, life-altering hearing in front of Mark Ciavarella lasted anywhere from a mere 60 seconds to a maximum of 3 minutes. A 13-year-old child, terrified, crying, and visibly shaking, would stand before the massive wooden bench completely alone, unrepresented by legal counsel, facing the full, crushing weight of the state. The child would stammer, attempting to desperately explain a minor offense or apologize for a mistake. Before the child or the weeping parents standing nervously behind them could even fully articulate a single, complete sentence in their own defense, Ciavarella would strike his heavy wooden gavel with deafening force. Without ever looking the crying child in the eye, his voice would boom across the silent, terrifying room with a single, devastating, life-ruining word: remanded. Instantly, the meticulously planned physical machinery of the court would violently activate. Armed court officers would aggressively move in. The shocked child would be grabbed by the arms, their wrists tightly handcuffed behind their backs, and heavy metal shackles forcefully locked around their small ankles right in front of their screaming, crying, completely helpless parents. The families were deliberately not given a single chance to hug their children, comfort them, or even say a proper goodbye. The shackled children, screaming for their mothers, were immediately dragged through a secure side door, loaded into the back of a dark, steel-caged transport van, and driven away to a maximum security lockup miles away from their homes. Parents who dared to loudly question the judge, parents who begged on their knees for mercy, or parents who simply cried too loudly in the gallery were immediately threatened with incarceration for contempt of court. The entire courtroom was ruled by an atmosphere of absolute totalitarian fear and intense, unapologetic intimidation. For years, the local community rationalized and justified this daily, unspeakable horror. They whispered in the local grocery stores and the neighborhood diners that the kids must have done something truly terrible behind closed doors to deserve such a harsh, immediate, and brutal punishment. The psychological illusion was absolutely perfect. The general public went to sleep at night, comfortably believing they were safe from the imagined threat of juvenile crime. The parents, though devastated and heartbroken, ultimately believed the justice system was working exactly as it was intended to. But as thousands upon thousands of minor children were being physically shipped away in heavy iron shackles, a dark, deeply disturbing, multi-million-dollar reality remained completely hidden from the public eye. These children were not being locked up to protect the community. They were not being rehabilitated to become better citizens. They were being violently locked up, stripped of their youth, and traumatized for life, because they were the physical, living raw materials desperately needed to fuel a massive, highly profitable, completely illegal corporate machine. To truly dismantle the highly complex mechanics of the largest and most devastating judicial corruption scandal in American history, we must momentarily step out of Mark Ciavarella's terrifying, fast-paced courtroom and walk into the quiet, heavily guarded, and deeply secretive administrative offices of Luzerne County. Behind every massive, systemic, multi-million-dollar corruption network, there is not just a highly visible public enforcer, but a silent, incredibly powerful architect who meticulously builds the financial blueprint behind closed doors. In this dark and devastating story, that silent architect was not Mark Ciavarella. It was his direct superior, President Judge Michael Conahan. While Ciavarella was the terrifying public face of the county's brutal zero-tolerance policy, aggressively locking up crying children and relentlessly feeding the local media frenzy, Michael Conahan was the calculating, cold-blooded man operating entirely behind the heavy velvet curtain. In the year 2002, Michael Conahan achieved a massive and pivotal elevation in his legal career when he was officially elected and installed as the President Judge of the Luzerne County Court of Common Pleas. To the general public, this might have simply sounded like a ceremonial promotion, a nice title to put on a brass nameplate. But under Pennsylvania state law, the position of President Judge is far from ceremonial. It carries immense, sweeping, and almost entirely unchecked administrative and financial power over the entire county court system. Overnight, Conahan was instantly granted the ultimate, unappealable authority over the county court's massive, multi-million-dollar operating budget. He controlled the hiring and firing of all court personnel. He had the power to assign specific judges to specific dockets, and most critically to this criminal conspiracy, he was granted the absolute unilateral authority to legally dictate exactly where juvenile offenders would be physically housed after they were sentenced by his subordinate, Judge Ciavarella. Conahan had the absolute power to make or break entire county institutions with a single, legally binding signature on a judicial court order. At the exact time President Judge Conahan took this absolute administrative power, Luzerne County was actively operating its own traditional, government-run public juvenile detention center. It was a heavily utilized facility that had served the county for years, but it was aging rapidly and suffering from severe, visible structural neglect. For years leading up to this point, highly trained state inspectors operating under the strict guidelines of the Pennsylvania Department of Public Welfare, DPW, had been conducting routine audits and continuously issuing official written warnings about the deteriorating physical condition of the county-run building. There were heavily documented, verified issues with the internal plumbing systems, the structural integrity of the roof, and the overall security infrastructure required to safely house juvenile inmates. To fundamentally fix the existing facility, bring it completely up to strict state code, and keep it safely under transparent, government-funded public oversight, the local Luzerne County government would have needed to authorize and spend approximately $3 million in taxpayer funds. To any honest, fiscally responsible, and morally grounded public servant, the logical, legally sound step would be to present a bond issue or a detailed budget proposal to the county commissioners, approve the desperately needed repairs, and ensure the children of the county were kept in a regulated, safe, state-monitored environment. How does a sitting president judge completely dismantle a vital county-run institution without facing an immediate public revolt or a federal inquiry? The terrifying answer lies in the total weaponization of judicial authority. Michael Conahan and Mark Ciavarella did not look at the DPW inspection reports and see a crumbling public building that needed saving. They saw a massive, once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to completely privatize a public necessity and seamlessly siphon millions of taxpayer dollars directly into their own personal bank accounts. Instead of advocating for the completely reasonable $3 million repair budget, Judge Conahan used his sweeping, unchecked administrative power to completely and legally starve the public detention center of its lifeblood. In late 2002, Conahan took a devastating, highly calculated, and entirely unprecedented legal step. Without consulting the public or seeking a vote from the county commissioners, he unilaterally signed a legally binding judicial court order absolutely prohibiting any juveniles in Luzerne County from ever being sent to the county-run public facility again. In his official, signed judicial order, he heavily cited the state's poor inspection reports from the Department of Public Welfare as his absolute, unquestionable legal justification, boldly claiming the facility was entirely unfit for human habitation. With a single, quiet stroke of a pen inside his private chambers, Conahan essentially defunded the public center overnight and forced it to permanently shut its heavy iron doors. The local county commissioners were completely blindsided by the sudden decree. The dedicated public center's employees tragically lost their jobs without warning. But Luzerne County, a sprawling region with a population of over 300,000 people, still desperately needed a secure, heavily fortified facility to house its juvenile offenders. This sudden, massive lack of infrastructure was not an accidental crisis or a tragic bureaucratic oversight. It was step one of a highly calculated, meticulously designed, multi-million-dollar criminal business plan that had been secretly negotiated and finalized months in advance behind closed doors. Enter the two wealthy, powerful men who would physically build this corrupt empire from the ground up: Robert Powell and Robert Miracle. Robert Powell was not a judge. He was a highly prominent, incredibly wealthy, and famously flashy personal injury attorney operating in the northeastern Pennsylvania area. He was widely known for aggressively winning massive, multi-million-dollar legal settlements, wearing expensive designer suits, and flying across the country in private, chartered jets. Powell saw the orchestrated, highly suspicious, impending closure of the Luzerne County Public Juvenile Facility not as a community tragedy, but as a massive, unparalleled financial windfall. Sensing a guaranteed, government-mandated monopoly, Powell quietly partnered with his business associate, Gregory Zappala, a man who federal investigators later confirmed was entirely unaware of the illegal kickbacks taking place, to quickly form a private, strictly for-profit corporate entity named PA Childcare LLC. Powell's ultimate, highly ambitious goal was to completely replace the government facility by building a brand-new, massive, state-of-the-art, maximum-security private juvenile detention center in nearby Pittston Township. But building a massive prison from the ground up requires immense, upfront capital, heavy machinery, and a massive, highly coordinated construction apparatus. To build his vision, Powell hired Robert Miracle. Miracle was a locally famous, incredibly wealthy, and deeply connected real estate developer whose massive corporation, Miracle Commercial Real Estate Services, heavily dominated the commercial construction and real estate industry throughout the entire region of northeastern Pennsylvania. However, a private, for-profit prison is only a highly lucrative business if it has a constant, mathematically guaranteed stream of inmates. Powell and Miracle were taking a massive, multi-million-dollar financial risk by purchasing the land and pouring concrete for this massive facility. They desperately needed an absolute, ironclad, legally binding guarantee that Luzerne County would not only officially use their new highly expensive facility, but would actively fill it to its absolute maximum capacity year after year. And that is exactly where the two corrupt judges, Michael Conahan and Mark Ciavarella, stepped out of the shadows, sat at the negotiating table, and relentlessly demanded their cut of the profits. According to massive federal indictments, thousands of pages of subpoenaed bank records, heavily encrypted emails, and extensive FBI and IRS criminal investigations, Judge Conahan and Judge Ciavarella secretly entered into a massive, highly illegal criminal conspiracy with the billionaire developer and the facility owner. The judges agreed to use their absolute judicial power to actively facilitate the massive multi-million-dollar construction contracts and absolutely guarantee the continuous, unrelenting daily placement of juveniles into Powell's private facility. In return for this unprecedented abuse of power, the judges demanded what they casually, arrogantly, and entirely illegally referred to in private conversations as a standard finder's fee. In the strict, unforgiving eyes of federal law, this was not a finder's fee. It was a massive, highly organized criminal extortion and kickback scheme deliberately designed to aggressively defraud the taxpayers of the United States. The exact, meticulously documented timeline of the financial payouts, completely reconstructed a year later by highly trained forensic accountants at the Internal Revenue Service, IRS, is utterly staggering in its sheer audacity. In January 2003, for successfully securing the initial, highly lucrative, multi-million-dollar contract to build the massive PA childcare facility, Robert Miracle, the billionaire builder, paid the two sitting judges an initial, massive kickback of exactly $990,000. Miracle, fully knowing the illegal nature of the transaction, deliberately and illegally disguised this massive near-million-dollar payment in his official corporate accounting books as a standard brokerage fee. This was a blatant, highly illegal corporate lie, given the glaring, indisputable fact that neither Judge Conahan nor Judge Ciavarella held a valid, state-issued real estate broker's license in the state of Pennsylvania. The criminal scheme proved to be so incredibly profitable and seamlessly successful that shortly after the very first facility was completed, Robert Powell decided to aggressively and rapidly expand his private prison empire by building a second, equally massive private detention facility called Western PA Childcare, located miles away in Butler County. Because the corrupt judge's influence and judicial power were absolutely vital to securing the new county contracts, Miracle enthusiastically paid the judges another astonishing $1 million in illegal, untraceable kickbacks for the seamless construction of the second facility. But the ruthless extortion did not stop at the concrete and steel construction phase. The judges were utterly insatiable, completely addicted to the massive influx of dirty cash. Once the heavy electronic metal doors of PA Childcare officially opened for business in February 2003, Robert Powell, the facility's high-flying co-owner, quickly found himself deeply trapped in a relentless, terrifying cycle of ongoing extortion. Powell was continuously pressured, aggressively threatened, and legally coerced by the very men who controlled his fate into paying the judges hundreds of thousands of dollars more in raw cash. This secondary stream of illegal money was demanded just to guarantee that Judge Ciavarella would keep his ruthless courtroom assembly line moving at maximum speed and keep relentlessly sending local children to fill the empty, highly expensive beds. Powell would later sit in a federal courtroom, sweating under intense cross-examination, and testify under oath that he paid the judges millions of dollars simply to keep the peace and ensure his highly leveraged, heavily indebted private prison business didn't go completely bankrupt under the crushing weight of its own massive bank loans. The actual method of these ongoing payments was completely unbelievable, straight out of a gritty mafia movie. Extensive FBI surveillance records and sworn, heavily corroborated testimonies revealed that Powell literally stuffed tens of thousands of dollars in hidden, untraceable cash into standard FedEx shipping boxes and secretly delivered them directly to the judges. Over the course of the conspiracy, he routinely funneled massive sums of dirty money to them, ultimately paying the judges an estimated $700,000 to $800,000 in ongoing operational kickbacks, entirely on top of the millions they had already received from the builder. To further secure the absolute, long-term financial success of the private prison, and to strictly ensure their massive illegal kickbacks would never dry up, President Judge Conahan used his unchecked judicial authority to commit his final, most devastating and mathematically terrifying administrative crime. He deliberately, quietly, and entirely illegally bypassed the standard county budgetary oversight committee, completely ignored the public bidding process, and aggressively forced Luzerne County into signing an astronomical, legally binding 20-year lease agreement with PA Childcare. The total, inescapable, heavily documented cost to the local taxpayers was an unbelievable, staggering $58 million. This legally binding, multi-decade agreement was not just a standard commercial lease, it was a guaranteed taxpayer-funded placement contract. It meant that Powell's private, for-profit company would receive millions of dollars in public taxpayer funds every single year for 2 entire decades, absolutely regardless of how many kids were actually detained inside the facility. It was a flawless, taxpayer-funded, multi-million-dollar monopoly, entirely engineered, signed, and enforced by the very men who swore an oath on a Bible to protect the public trust. But building a massive, state-of-the-art private prison and securing a $58 million taxpayer-funded lease is only half the battle. A private detention center is fundamentally a corporate business, and what is the one critical thing every single corporate business requires to survive and turn a massive profit? It requires a constant, unending, reliable supply of inventory. If the inventory stops flowing, the business collapses, the lease is heavily scrutinized, and the multi-million-dollar kickbacks completely dry up. So how exactly do you guarantee a constant, daily supply of inventory when the inventory itself is living, breathing children from your own community? You turn the local courtroom into a ruthless, high-speed child processing factory. You strip away their constitutional rights, you ignore their crying mothers, and you legally mandate that every minor mistake results in maximum security detention. Judge Mark Ciavarella knew exactly what he had to do to keep the massive criminal enterprise afloat, and he did it with terrifying efficiency every single morning. With millions of dollars now illegally and continuously flowing directly to the judges from both the massive commercial builder and the panicked facility owner, Conahan and Ciavarella faced a massive, highly dangerous new problem: advanced money laundering. You cannot simply deposit $2.6 million to $2.8 million in illegal, untraceable extortion money into a standard, local checking account on a Pennsylvania judge's government salary without instantly triggering massive suspicious activity reports, SARs, and alerting highly trained federal tax authorities. To expertly launder the dirty money, completely hide their tracks, and legitimize their stolen wealth, Conahan and Ciavarella created highly sophisticated, incredibly complex, and entirely untraceable corporate shell companies. Federal tax documents, subpoenaed international wire transfers, and years of grueling forensic accounting revealed that the judges officially formed a Florida-based corporate business entity called Pinnacle Group of Jupiter LLC. To further obscure their direct, highly illegal involvement, they initially, maliciously placed their own wives' names on the official corporate paperwork, effectively making their families complicit before ultimately taking full, direct financial control of the accounts. They also utilized another shadowy, completely fake and heavily disguised company named Beverage Marketing of Pennsylvania, Inc. The massive million-dollar electronic wire transfers from Miracle and the FedEx cash boxes from Powell were deliberately routed directly into these specific, heavily guarded shell accounts. On official, sworn federal tax documents, this massive influx of blood money was heavily and illegally disguised as legitimate, highly taxed consulting fees, standard rent payments, and complex commercial real estate transactions. What exactly did these two deeply corrupt men do with this staggering, completely unearned amount of stolen wealth? Direct FBI evidence, seized bank records, and heavily audited property deeds proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that they used the stolen funds to finance a lavish, highly exclusive millionaire lifestyle that was entirely worlds away from the bleak, cold, terrifying courtrooms of Pennsylvania where children were actively crying for their parents. They funneled hundreds of thousands of dollars of stolen money into buying a luxurious, multi-million-dollar waterfront condominium in the highly exclusive, sun-drenched enclave of Jupiter, Florida. They used the massive extortion money to purchase a massive, incredibly expensive high-performance yacht, which they arrogantly, almost mockingly named the Oasis. They lived like completely untouchable kings, drinking expensive wine and sailing in the Florida sun, entirely funded by the systematic, daily, and highly calculated destruction of local, hard-working, working-class families in Luzerne County. The architecture of the scam was completely, utterly flawless. Miracle got his massive, multi-million-dollar construction contracts and expanded his empire. Powell got a mathematically guaranteed $58 million taxpayer monopoly and 2 brand new, massive, fully funded detention facilities. Conahan and Ciavarella got rich beyond their wildest, most greedy dreams, successfully hiding their stolen wealth in luxury Florida real estate and offshore-style corporate shell accounts. Everything was perfectly, legally in place. But as the judges sailed their luxury yacht in the warm waters of Florida, thousands of miles away in the cold, unforgiving concrete cells of Pennsylvania, the true cost of their massive wealth was being paid in full by the very children they swore to protect. When we finally strip away the complex money laundering, the massive shell companies, and the Florida mansions, we are left with the heartbreaking, completely devastating human toll. This brings us directly to the true victims of this story. To understand the true horror of the Kids for Cash scandal, we must stop looking at the millions of dollars in bank accounts and start looking at the faces of the children whose lives were used as currency. Behind every legal filing and every bribe was a living, breathing teenager who was about to be crushed by a system they were told to trust. The tragedy of Luzerne County wasn't just about corrupt judges. It was about the systematic destruction of human potential. One of the most famous and heartbreaking cases is that of Hillary Transue. In the year 2007, Hillary was a 15-year-old high school student with a bright future and no prior criminal record. Like many teenagers of her generation, she was expressive and digitally active. As a joke, Hillary created a parody MySpace page mocking her assistant principal. It was typical teenage rebellion, childish, perhaps rude, but certainly not a crime. However, under the zero-tolerance regime of Judge Mark Ciavarella, this minor act of satire was treated as a major threat to social order. When Hillary arrived at the courthouse with her mother, Lorene Transue, they were terrified but hopeful. They believed that once the judge saw Hillary was a good student from a stable home, he would give her a stern warning or community service. But before they even entered the courtroom, the trap was set. A probation officer handed Lorene a clipboard and told her to sign a document waiving Hillary's right to a lawyer. The officer claimed it would make the process quicker and easier. Trusting the authority of the court, Lorene signed the paper, unknowingly stripping her daughter of her only legal protection. Inside the courtroom, the hearing was a brutal mockery of justice. It lasted less than 90 seconds. Judge Ciavarella didn't ask about Hillary's grades or her character. He didn't care that the assistant principal hadn't even requested criminal charges. He simply looked at this 15-year-old girl and barked the word, remanded. Before Hillary could even process what was happening, handcuffs were clamped onto her wrists. Her mother began to scream in shock, but she was silenced by court officers. Hillary was led away in shackles and sent to a maximum security juvenile facility for 3 months. She was forced to spend her days behind bars with violent offenders, all because of a parody website. But why was this happening to so many children at once? Why would a judge risk his entire career and reputation to send a girl like Hillary to a private prison for a joke? The chilling answer, which the families didn't know yet, was that the more children Ciavarella sent to PA childcare, the more legitimate the facility's existence became, and the more the kickback money kept flowing. The children weren't defendants, they were units of profit. Then there was the case of Justin Bodnar. Justin was only 12 years old when he stood before Ciavarella. His crime was shouting an insult at a classmate's mother during an argument. In any other county, this would have been a matter for the school counselor or the parents to handle. But in Ciavarella's court, a 12-year-old boy was treated like a career criminal. Justin was also unrepresented by a lawyer, and his hearing was equally swift. Within minutes, Ciavarella sentenced the boy to a detention facility. Justin spent years cycling through the juvenile system, moving from one facility to another. The trauma of being incarcerated at such a young age completely derailed his life. He lost his connection to his education, his family, and his sense of self. By the time he was released, the damage was permanent. He was no longer a child. He was a victim of state-sponsored kidnapping. Another devastating story is that of Edward Kenzikoski. Ed was an all-star wrestler with a promising future. He was involved in a minor scuffle, a typical teenage fight. Ciavarella didn't just give him a few weeks of detention. He sent him away for months. When Ed finally got out, his spirit was broken. He struggled with the stigma of being a criminal and the trauma of what he had seen inside the facilities. His mother, Sandy Fonzo, watched helplessly as her son spiraled into depression. Tragically, a year later, the weight of this trauma became too much for Edward to bear, and he took his own life. Sandy Fonzo would later become the face of the grieving parents, famously confronting Mark Ciavarella outside the courthouse, screaming at the man who had effectively signed her son's death warrant for a few $1,000s in bribes. The psychological impact of these placements cannot be overstated. These children were sent to facilities like Western PA Child Care, where they were subjected to strip searches, communal showers, and the constant threat of violence from older, more dangerous inmates. They were often denied proper education and mental health support. For many of these kids, the experience of being remanded was the moment their childhood ended and their nightmare began. They were told they were being rehabilitated, but in reality, they were being warehoused to ensure a private corporation could meet its bottom line. The efficiency of Ciavarella's courtroom was legendary among local lawyers, but for the wrong reasons. He prided himself on clearing his docket with lightning speed. Between the years 2003 and 2008, thousands of children passed through his doors. Many of them were first-time offenders who had committed acts like trespassing in an abandoned building or a minor theft of a few dollars. In one instance, a child was sent away for throwing a piece of steak at her mother's boyfriend during dinner. In another, a boy was incarcerated for possessing a stolen scooter that he didn't even know was stolen. These weren't dangerous predators. They were children making mistakes, and the system was designed to catch them and never let them go. What made this even more sinister was the silence of the other professionals in the room. There were prosecutors, probation officers, and court staff who watched these 60-second hearings every single day. They saw children being shackled without lawyers. They saw the placement rates climbing to 26%. Yet, for a long time, no one spoke up. The fear of Judge Ciavarella and President Judge Conahan was so great that the entire legal community of Luzerne County became complicit in the crime. They normalized the unthinkable. They watched as the Sixth Amendment was burned to the ground, all while the two judges were secretly planning their next luxury vacation to Florida. The families of these children were left in a state of perpetual shock. They were hard-working people who believed in the law. They taught their children to respect the police and the courts. To have that same system turn around and treat their children like trash for profit was a betrayal that many would never recover from. The Kids for Cash scandal wasn't just a financial crime. It was a massive human rights violation carried out in the name of the state. Thousands of futures were discarded. Thousands of families were bankrupted by legal fees and the cost of visiting their children in distant facilities. And a generation of Luzerne County youth was left with a deep, permanent scar of distrust toward the government. As we look at the empty chairs in the classrooms of Luzerne County during those dark years, we have to realize that this was a crime against the future. The money has been tracked, the judges have been caught, but for the children who spent their formative years behind barbed wire because of a parody MySpace page or a $4 jar of nutmeg, justice is a very complicated word. They were the fuel for a machine that never should have existed. And their stories are the ultimate proof of what happens when greed is allowed to sit on the bench. For nearly a decade, the corrupt empire of Mark Ciavarella and Michael Conahan appeared to be completely untouchable. They had successfully silenced the local legal community through fear, manipulated the public through a crusade of zero tolerance, and built a financial fortress through complex shell companies. To anyone in Luzerne County, these judges were the law. But every criminal enterprise, no matter how meticulously designed, eventually leaves a trail that cannot be hidden. The unraveling of the Kids for Cash scandal didn't start with a dramatic police raid. It began with a mother's refusal to accept an injustice and the persistent curiosity of a group of civil rights attorneys miles away in Philadelphia. The first major crack in the facade appeared in the year 2007. Laureen Transue, the mother of Hillary Transue, the girl sentenced to 3 months for a MySpace parody, knew in her heart that what happened to her daughter was not just harsh, it was illegal. She began making phone calls, desperately searching for anyone who would listen to the story of a 15-year-old girl being shackled without a lawyer for a joke. Her search eventually led her to the Juvenile Law Center, JLC, in Philadelphia, a nonprofit organization dedicated to protecting the rights of children in the justice system. When the attorneys at JLC, including Marcia Levick and Lourdes Rosado, first heard Hillary's story, they were stunned. But as they began to look deeper into the court records of Luzerne County, their shock turned into a deep, cold fury. The data they uncovered was an absolute legal anomaly. They saw that over 50% of children in Ciavarella's court were waiving their right to counsel, a number that was statistically impossible in any fair system. They saw placement rates that were triple the state average. It became clear that this wasn't just about one girl and a MySpace page. It was a systemic collapse of constitutional rights. In the spring of 2008, the Juvenile Law Center filed a massive petition with the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, asking them to intervene and investigate the juvenile court practices in Luzerne County. But the road to justice was not easy. In a shocking turn of events, the state Supreme Court initially denied the petition without any explanation. It seemed as though the judge's influence reached even the highest levels of the state government. But why was the highest court in the state ignoring such blatant evidence of abuse? Was it simply a matter of judicial professional courtesy? Or was the rot in the system even deeper than anyone imagined? This temporary setback could have been the end of the story, but while the JLC was fighting a public legal battle, a much more dangerous storm was quietly gathering in the shadows. Unbeknownst to Ciavarella and Conahan, they were already being hunted. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, and the Internal Revenue Service, IRS, had been conducting a long-term, highly secretive undercover investigation into the Luzerne County Courthouse. However, interestingly, the federal agents weren't initially looking for kids for cash. They were actually investigating a completely different web of corruption involving county commissioners and backroom political deals. But as they wiretapped phones and followed the money trail of local contractors, all roads kept leading back to the chambers of the two most powerful judges in the county. Federal agents began to notice a strange pattern of financial activity. They tracked the formation of a Florida company called Pinnacle Group of Jupiter, LLC. They saw massive wire transfers and suspicious deposits that didn't align with a judge's government salary. Forensic accountants from the IRS began to meticulously piece together the puzzle of the shell companies and the luxury Florida condo. They were looking for tax evasion, but what they found was the scent of a much larger, more sinister conspiracy. By mid-2008, the federal investigation and the Juvenile Law Center's efforts began to converge into a single, unstoppable force. The tension in Luzerne County began to rise as federal subpoenas started arriving at the courthouse. The judges, once arrogant and untouchable, began to realize that their empire was under siege. Michael Conahan, the architect, attempted to use his administrative power to block access to records, but the federal government was not intimidated. Agents were now interviewing people like Robert Powell, the owner of the private prison, and Robert Miracle, the developer. Facing decades in federal prison for their own roles in the bribery, these men began to do the one thing the judges feared most. They started to talk. Robert Powell eventually agreed to wear a wire for the FBI. In a series of highly secretive and dangerous meetings, he recorded conversations with the judges that provided the smoking gun the federal government needed. These recordings captured the judges discussing the kickbacks and coordinating their stories to hide the money. The once mighty guardians of the law were now caught on tape like common street criminals, arguing over the spoils of their crime. The evidence was now overwhelming. The federal government had the wire transfers, they had the tax records, they had the testimony of the co-conspirators, and they had the voices of the judges themselves. In January 2009, the bomb finally dropped. The U.S. Attorney's Office for the Middle District of Pennsylvania officially announced that Judge Mark Ciavarella and Judge Michael Conahan had signed plea agreements admitting to a massive honest services fraud and tax evasion scheme involving $2.6 million in kickbacks. The news hit Luzerne County like an earthquake. The community that had revered these men for over a decade was suddenly forced to confront a horrifying reality. Their hero judges were actually predators who had sold their children for a luxury lifestyle. But the federal announcement was only the beginning of the end. The plea deal originally called for only 7 years in prison, a sentence that many victims felt was an insult to the thousands of lives they had destroyed. The public outcry was immediate and visceral. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court, feeling the immense pressure of the federal investigation and the public's rage, finally reversed its earlier decision. They appointed a special master, Senior Judge Arthur Grimm, to review every single juvenile case handled by Ciavarella over the previous 5 years. As the federal prosecutors and Judge Grimm began to dig through the wreckage, the full scale of the horror was finally revealed to the world. They didn't just find financial crimes, they found a graveyard of constitutional rights. They found thousands of cases where children had been sent to jail in hearings that lasted less than 60 seconds. They found children who had been incarcerated for years for crimes that didn't even exist on the books. The unraveling was no longer just a legal process. It was a national scandal that exposed the darkest corners of the American judicial system. the judges' attempt to control the narrative had failed completely. Their power was gone, their reputations were in ruins, and the federal government was no longer interested in a lenient plea deal. The stage was set for a massive legal battle that would determine if the system could actually provide justice for the very children it had helped to destroy. The empire had fallen, but the fight for the souls of the victims had just begun. By the beginning of 2009, the once mighty pillars of the Luzerne County Judiciary had officially crumbled. The announcement of the federal investigation and the subsequent plea agreements of Mark Ciavarella and Michael Conahan sent shockwaves through the American legal system. But if the public expected a quick and quiet end to this nightmare, they were gravely mistaken. What followed was one of the most dramatic, emotionally charged, and high-stakes legal battles in the history of Pennsylvania. The fall of the judges was not just a legal process, it was a public exorcism of a decade of corruption. The initial plea deal offered by federal prosecutors was for a sentence of only 7 years in prison. To the thousands of families whose lives had been shattered, this felt like a second betrayal. The outrage was so intense that it reached the desk of senior U.S. District Judge Edwin Kosick. In a rare and courageous judicial move, Judge Kosick rejected the plea agreement in July 2009, stating that the 7-year sentence was far too lenient and that the judges had not shown genuine remorse for the human suffering they had caused. This rejection changed everything. Michael Conahan, the silent architect, chose to plead guilty and cooperate, eventually receiving a sentence of 17.5 years in federal prison. But Mark Ciavarella, the man who had looked thousands of children in the eye before shackling them, chose a different path. He decided to fight. The trial of Mark Ciavarella began in February 2011 in a federal courtroom in Scranton, Pennsylvania. It was a spectacle of arrogance versus agony. Ciavarella's defense strategy was as shocking as his crimes. He didn't deny taking the money. Instead, he and his lawyers argued that the $2.6 million he received was not a kickback or a bribe, but a legitimate finder's fee for his role in the construction of the private prisons. He maintained a delusional stance that his judicial decisions were never influenced by the money. He claimed he sent those children to jail because he believed in zero tolerance, not because he was getting paid per bed. As the trial progressed, the prosecution dismantled this defense piece by piece. They called Robert Powell and Robert Miracle to the stand. These men, once the judge's closest criminal associates, testified in chilling detail about the pressure Ciavarella and Conahan placed on them. They described the FedEx boxes filled with cash and the constant demands for more money to keep the peace. But the most powerful testimony didn't come from the billionaires. It came from the ledgers of the IRS. Forensic accountants showed a direct, undeniable correlation between the opening of the private facilities and the sudden, massive spike in juvenile incarcerations in Luzerne County. Why would a man who spent his entire career as a guardian of the law believe he could convince a jury that millions of dollars in secret cash was just a business fee? Did he truly believe his own lies? Or was his arrogance so deep that he thought he was still untouchable even in a federal dock? This question hung over the courtroom as the jury watched Ciavarella's cold, unrepentant demeanor throughout the proceedings. The emotional climax of the trial occurred outside the courtroom. One afternoon, as Ciavarella was walking toward the courthouse doors, he was confronted by Sandy Fonzo, the mother of Edward Kenzakowski, the all-star wrestler who had taken his own life after being traumatized by Ciavarella's sentencing. In a scene that was captured by news cameras and broadcasted globally, Sandy Fonzo stood inches away from the man who had destroyed her family. She screamed at him with a raw, agonizing pain. "My son is dead. He's gone because of you. You sold him for money." Ciavarella's reaction was chilling. He didn't look away, and he didn't apologize. He simply smirked and kept walking. That smirk became the defining image of the Kids for Cash scandal. The face of a man who saw children as nothing more than line items on a balance sheet. Inside the courtroom, the jury was not moved by Ciavarella's defiance. After days of deliberation, they returned a verdict of guilty on 12 federal counts, including racketeering, money laundering, and tax evasion. However, in a confusing twist, they acquitted him on the specific charges of extortion and bribery related directly to the per-child payments, primarily because the legal definition of a bribe in federal court is notoriously difficult to prove without an explicit quid pro quo agreement caught on tape. But the racketeering and money laundering convictions were more than enough to ensure he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. In August 2011, Mark Ciavarella stood before Judge Edwin Kosick to receive his sentence. The courtroom was packed with victims and their families. Judge Kosick did not hold back. He spoke of the unimaginable breach of trust and the stolen futures of thousands of children. He then delivered a sentence that echoed like a thunderclap: 28 years in federal prison. For a man who was 61 years old at the time, this was effectively a life sentence. Ciavarella was ordered to be taken into custody immediately. The man who had spent a decade ordering children into shackles was finally led away in handcuffs himself, wearing the same chains he had forced upon so many others. But the criminal sentences were only part of the fall. While the judges were being sent to prison, the civil legal battle was just beginning. A massive class action lawsuit was filed on behalf of the thousands of victims. The builders, the prison owners, and the county insurance companies were eventually forced to pay out over $200 million in settlements to the victims and their families. While no amount of money could ever bring back a stolen childhood or revive those who had lost their lives to despair, the settlements provided a form of acknowledgement that the state had failed its citizens. The fallout also reached the bench of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. The scandal led to a total overhaul of the state's juvenile justice system. New laws were passed to ensure that every child appearing in court had a mandatory right to a lawyer that could not be easily waived. The Interbranch Commission on Juvenile Justice was formed to investigate how such a massive failure could happen and to ensure it never happened again. The corrupt legacy of Ciavarella and Conahan became a permanent case study in legal ethics classes across the world, a dark reminder of what happens when judicial power is left unchecked. As the prison doors closed on Mark Ciavarella, he continued to maintain his innocence from his cell, filing appeal after appeal. He blamed the media, he blamed the federal government, and he blamed the unruly children of Luzerne County. But the world had moved on. The Kids for Cash system was dead. The concrete walls of PA childcare were still standing, but they were now under new, heavily monitored management. The children of Luzerne County were finally safe from the predators in black robes. The fall of the judges was complete, but the scars they left on the community were permanent. A generation of youth had grown up believing that justice was something that could be bought and sold. The final chapter of this story isn't about the prison sentences or the millions of dollars in settlements. It's about the long, painful process of rebuilding trust in a system that had so violently betrayed its most sacred oath. The sentencing of Mark Ciavarella and Michael Conahan marked the end of their personal reign of terror, but for the community of Luzerne County, the nightmare did not simply vanish when the prison doors slammed shut. The aftermath of the Kids for Cash scandal was a long, painful, and agonizingly slow process of picking up the pieces of thousands of shattered lives. It was a period of deep reflection, systemic reform, and a desperate struggle to restore faith in a judicial system that had effectively cannibalized its own children for profit. The first and most urgent priority for the state of Pennsylvania was to address the legal status of the victims. Between the years 2003 and 2008, Judge Ciavarella had presided over thousands of juvenile cases, many of which were completed in less than 60 seconds without the presence of a defense attorney. Following the federal convictions, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court appointed Senior Judge Arthur Grimm as a special master to review the massive wreckage of Ciavarella's career. His task was monumental and unprecedented in American legal history. After a meticulous and exhaustive review, Judge Grimm issued a recommendation that shook the foundations of the state's judiciary. He recommended the immediate and total expungement of nearly 4,000 juvenile convictions. This meant that for thousands of young adults, the criminal labels that had haunted them for years, labels that had prevented them from joining the military, getting college loans, or finding employment, were legally wiped away. The state essentially admitted that these thousands of trials were not trials at all. They were state-sponsored kidnappings. For the victims, this was a moment of immense emotional release, but it was also a bitter reminder of the years they had already lost. You can expunge a digital record on a computer, but how do you expunge the memory of a 13-year-old boy being shackled in front of his mother, or the months a young girl spent in a concrete cell with violent offenders? As the records were being cleared, the financial reckoning began. A massive, complex class action lawsuit was moving through the civil courts, targeting every individual and corporation that had profited from the scheme. The billionaire developer Robert Miracle, the facility owner Robert Powell, and the various insurance companies representing Luzerne County were eventually forced to agree to a series of massive settlements. By the year 2022, the total settlement amount awarded to the victims and their families exceeded $200 million. For many families, this money was used to pay off the crushing legal debts they had incurred while trying to save their children, or to fund the intensive psychological therapy that many victims required to cope with their post-traumatic stress disorder. However, amidst the settlements and the expungements, a haunting question remained at the center of the community's grief. If the two judges were the only ones sent to prison for the actual Kids for Cash scheme, what about the dozens of lawyers, prosecutors, and probation officers who stood in that courtroom every day and said nothing? Was it possible for such a massive conspiracy to exist for nearly a decade without the implicit cooperation of an entire legal ecosystem? This realization led to a profound sense of betrayal that went far beyond the two men in black robes. It exposed a culture of silence and professional cowardice that had allowed a constitutional disaster to go unchecked. The legacy of the scandal forced the state of Pennsylvania to undergo a radical transformation of its juvenile justice infrastructure. The Interbranch Commission on Juvenile Justice was established to analyze the systemic failures of Luzerne County. Their final report was a scathing indictment of the lack of oversight. As a direct result, the state passed sweeping legislative reforms. One of the most significant changes was the mandatory requirement for legal counsel in all juvenile proceedings. In Pennsylvania today, a child cannot waive their right to a lawyer without a thorough, on-the-record hearing, where a judge must ensure the child fully understands what they are giving up. The clipboard waivers in the courthouse hallways, which Ciavarella had used to strip children of their rights, were now strictly illegal. The physical landmarks of the scandal also saw a transformation. The private detention centers, PA Childcare and Western PA Childcare, did not close down immediately. Instead, they were placed under intense, near-constant state monitoring and eventually sold to new management. They serve as a grim, standing reminder of what happens when the incarceration of human beings is turned into a for-profit enterprise. The scandal became the primary catalyst for the national anti-privatization movement in the American prison system, with activists using Luzerne County as the ultimate cautionary tale of why justice and profit should never be mixed. The human legacy of the scandal is perhaps the most difficult to quantify. Many of the Kids for Cash victims struggled with lifelong issues of substance abuse, depression, and a deep-seated, unshakable fear of the police and the courts. The trust that is essential for a functioning society, the belief that the law is a protective shield, was systematically destroyed for an entire generation of Luzerne County youth. Some victims, like Edward Kenzakowski, never lived to see the judges go to prison or the settlements be paid. Their lives are the ultimate cost of the $2.6 million in bribes. Today, the Kids for Cash scandal is taught in law schools and ethics seminars across the globe. It is cited in Supreme Court briefs and human rights reports. It stands as the definitive example of judicial overreach and systemic corruption. The names of Mark Ciavarella and Michael Conahan have become synonymous with the betrayal of the judicial oath. They are currently serving their lengthy sentences in federal facilities, far away from the community they once ruled with an iron fist. Ciavarella, in particular, remains a defiant figure, occasionally filing appeals from his cell, still maintaining that he was a tough judge rather than a corrupt one. But the world knows the truth. As we look back at this dark chapter of American history, we are left with a sobering reality. The system didn't catch Ciavarella and Conahan because the system worked. They were caught because they got too greedy, and because a few persistent mothers and lawyers refused to stop fighting. The Kids for Cash scandal teaches us that justice is not a self-sustaining machine. It requires constant vigilance, the courage to speak up when something feels wrong, and a fundamental understanding that no person, no matter how powerful the robe they wear, is above the law. The story of Luzerne County is a reminder that the price of freedom is eternal watchfulness. The children who were sold for cash are now adults, many with children of their own. They carry the scars of the past, but they also carry the strength of survivors. Their victory wasn't just in the courtroom. It was in the fact that they survived a system designed to break them. And in doing so, they ensured that no other child in Pennsylvania would ever have to stand alone and unrepresented before a predator in a black robe. The silence in the Luzerne County courtroom has finally been replaced by the voices of the victims, and those voices will ensure that this story is never forgotten. As the sun sets over the Luzerne County Courthouse today, the building stands as a silent witness to a decade of betrayal. We have traveled through the dark corridors of a system that sold its own children for the price of a luxury lifestyle. We have seen the cold-blooded calculations of Michael Conahan and the iron-fisted arrogance of Mark Ciavarella. But as we close this chapter of American criminal history, we must ask ourselves a much deeper, more uncomfortable question. How many other Luzerne counties are out there right now, hidden behind the black robes of untouchable authority? The Kids for Cash scandal was not just a failure of two men. It was a failure of an entire community's silence. It was a failure of a legal system that prioritized efficiency and profit over the fundamental human rights of 13-year-old children. It serves as a haunting reminder that justice is not a self-sustaining machine. It is a fragile flame that requires the constant, unyielding oxygen of public scrutiny. When we stop asking questions, when we stop demanding transparency from those in power, and when we choose to look the other way because it doesn't directly affect our own families, that is exactly when corruption begins to breathe. To the thousands of victims who were shackled and silenced, this story is not just a documentary, it is their life. They are the living proof that a stolen childhood can never truly be repaid with a settlement check or an expunged record. They carry the weight of those concrete cells in their minds every single day. But their survival is also a testament to the power of the human spirit. Their bravery in finally speaking out, and the persistence of a few mothers who refused to be intimidated, is the only reason this massive criminal enterprise was finally dismantled. They taught us that the most dangerous weapon against corruption is not a gavel or a badge, but a voice that refuses to be silent. As a society, we must learn from this tragedy. We must realize that no official, no matter how many degrees they have or how high they sit on a bench, is above the law. We must teach our children not just to respect authority, but to understand their rights. Because a child who knows their rights is a child who cannot be easily exploited. We must demand that our justice systems remain focused on rehabilitation and humanity, rather than turning the incarceration of human beings into a profitable corporate business model. The moment we allow a price tag to be put on a human soul, we have already lost our way. This case is a wake-up call for every single person watching this video. It is a call to be vigilant, to be informed, and to be brave. If you see an injustice in your own community, do not assume someone else will fix it. If you see the rights of the vulnerable being trampled, do not look away. Corruption thrives in the darkness of apathy, but it withers under the bright light of public awareness. You are the ultimate guardians of justice. Your attention, your questions, and your refusal to accept the way things are the only things that keep the system honest. If this story has moved you, if it has made you angry, or if it has opened your eyes to the dark realities that can exist within our legal system, then I ask you to carry this message forward. Share this story not just for the views, but for the awareness. We must ensure that the names of the victims are remembered and the crimes of the judges are never repeated. Before you leave today, I want to hear from you. How do we, as a community, ensure that another Kids for Cash scandal never happens again? What can we do to better protect the rights of our youth? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Let's start a conversation that leads to real change. If you found this deep dive into the Kids for Cash system insightful, please subscribe to U.S. Crime Diaries and turn on the notification bell. We are dedicated to bringing you the most detailed, fact-based, and impactful crime stories from across the United States, because we believe that the first step toward justice is knowing the truth. Don't forget to like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear this story. Every share helps us reach more people and shine a light on the stories that the system would rather keep hidden. Thank you for your time, your support, and your commitment to the truth. Stay vigilant, stay informed, and most importantly, stay safe. Until next time, this is U.S. Crime Diaries.